She trusted him enough to fall asleep in his arms. That was, in a sentence, the contract the house kept. Cedar on the air, soft ceilings that swallowed the city's distant hum, a bed that felt arranged for two people who did not snore or insist on too much light. The house had been his gift. Billy's hand across a catalog purchase, his voice calibrated to the room's scale, the way he said, "You deserve this." It was a phrase heavy with selection, and selection made her feel chosen. She unpacked like a woman who had been promised a place at a table she had only ever watched from across rooms. Julia woke to the cedar first, a thin, wood-smoke sweetness that threaded the morning like a tuning note. It lay against her throat when she breathed, a gentle perfume that belonged more to old closets than to new houses. The light through the blinds was an even domestic wash. Billy's arm curved under her shoulders, his palm warm and confident where it rested on the mattress. He slept like a man who expected the world to go on in the same ordinary way, arms folded around net profits and brief affections. Even his breathing had the smoothness of social polish. She let herself lie there until his hair, damp at the nape, smelled of something cedar-adjacent, a woody cologne she had once teased him for. He woke first, eyes soft on her face. For a half-breath she allowed the luxury, owning a house that felt like a promise, being the center of someone's careful life. The rooms were tasteful, neutral walls, a lamp with a brass stem, a mirror that hung at the exact angle to catch a passing light, a single neat cedar box on a side table. A gray button lay atop a stack of magazines, unobtrusive as an afterthought. "It looks like you," he said. Billy, always ready to translate possession into compliment. "It feels like you." She smiled because she wanted to, and because that was what you did when someone who had the social gravity of Billy offered you solidity. She learned quickly how to accept things that felt like belonging and not to count the seams. The seams, she told herself, were inevitable in all gifts. There was a seam in affection, and in architecture too. The first week the house was exactly as promised, quiet, warm, reliable. The cedar scent lived in the house like a domestic refrain, threaded through the pillows, released when the closet door opened, traced in the light that lay on the coffee table. Julia placed the cedar box on the shelf and tapped the gray button into the box's corner, as if tucking a coin into a spare pocket. She liked small rituals. They made rooms less like evidence and more like narratives. She made coffee at the same hour every morning, arranged magazines by spine color, and read in the afternoon light at the window where the mirror caught her face and showed it to her twice. Skin and intent. At dusk she discovered the house's surveillance. A compact camera tucked into the lamp in the living room, almost invisible, its lens a dark bead. Billy had said it was for insurance, the kind of practical luxury that meant nothing was left to chance. Julia, who had been a no-frills renter most of her adult life, found the camera both comforting and obscene. It watched in a way that belonged to moneyed certainty, a promise that things would be kept or proved. She left it alone for a week. Then she moved it, for the private, foolish desire to see what recorded her smallest habits. The first anomaly was a photograph she took on a Sunday afternoon. It was a study in light, the couch, the seam where the cushion met the frame, the cedar dust that gathered like a pale film along the arm. She snapped the photo because she wanted to remember the way the house caught a particular sun. On her phone the image opened into a white square. There was nothing but a bleaching light where the couch should have been, as if the camera had inhaled the world and refused to let it out. Julia frowned, thumb hovering, then swiped back and forth. The phone functioned normally for everything else. She tapped the image to see it in full. The white held. For a moment, the mind invents explanation faster than suspicion grows. Overexposure, a software glitch, the camera's mood. She put the phone on the coffee table and did not tell Billy. That night, in bed, she woke to a scratching sound like paper on cloth. It was a gentle, sidelong noise, and for half a second she thought it was the cat of the building below. There was no cat. When she sat up, she noticed a thin crescent of wood dust along the inner fold of the couch, something like sawdust but softer, fragrant, so unmistakably cedar that she called Billy from the dark just to say the smell had been stronger. He came and smelled and shrugged and said it must be the boxes, the way the house was settling. His calm made the scent tolerable. She told Kem later. because telling someone makes anomalies less like ghosts. Kem came the next afternoon with the practical air of a good friend who had never been invited to a charity gala, and therefore never had to perform charm. He had a toolkit and a terse way of smiling. "You moved in fast," he said, sliding into the armchair with the casual authority of someone who balanced lives on ledgers and made possible mistakes seem small. It was his way of saying, "Stay," she said, because it was true. Kem examined the living room. The lamp, the camera tucked discreetly into its brass shade, the couch seam. He lifted the cushion and patted along the frame, the operation of a man who believed in edges and fasteners. He found nothing but the expected stuffing and the zip of the upholstery. He touched the cedar box with the same indifferent curiosity he applied to bank statements. "This is weird," he said. But weird doesn't always mean wrong. He was an accountant by trade, an observer by training. His default explanation was always a human error that could be corrected. They laughed, briefly, about how the house had the right to its own glitched aesthetics. And then they both turned that laughter into another ritual, a small ritual that said they had instruments to name the world. She set up the lamp camera again, angled so it would cover the couch seam, the place where the dust gathered. She liked the idea of a watchman in metal, evidence that would be impartial. She sat at the kitchen table, index finger pressed against her lip, as if she were composing an argument in which only facts could be trusted. She watched the lamp's tiny red light, a comforting little heartbeat. When she reviewed the footage the next morning, the file played perfectly until the moment she expected it to show the seam. At precisely 17 minutes and 8 seconds, the screen went to a white square like the photograph on her phone. A white blank, a washed-out confession. The audio carried a thin, broken hiss, and then nothing, as if someone had lifted a pen from paper mid-sentence. She opened the file on another device. Same white. She sent the file to Kem with a casual text. "Look at this?" He responded with an exasperated emoji and arrived with his laptop and a theory about codecs and software updates. But if it were software, why had the rest of the file remained intact? Why only the seam? He checked the camera, replaced the card, swapped lenses like a man dealing with a car that had developed a nervous tic. Later that evening he sat back on the couch and said, "There's a million plausible bugs." And in his voice, she heard the safe harbor of explanation. Billy hosted a small dinner party 2 weeks after she moved in. His circle was lubricated with easy compliments and money not yet shown as debt. Architects whose hands still smelled faintly of drywall, a woman from a gallery with immaculate nails and a laugh that left no residue. Julia found herself watching Billy the way one watches an actor who has learned how to move through rooms unerring. He had a laugh that put the world into a flattering frame. He told a story and people leaned in. He brushed against people's arms with the practiced casualness of someone who understood the currency of touch. When he looked at Julia across the grouping of strangers, something in his expression was like the small, private light you keep for a friend. Not an intensity so much as a proprietary brightness. She felt cherished. She felt, for reasons she resisted naming, chosen. After the party, a guest, an enthusiastic amateur photographer, offered to post a photo to her feed of the living room, the way the lamp had made the couch look luminous. Julia agreed. The photo went up with the vertex of an unneeded caption, "A perfect evening." In the comments, someone joked about Billy's taste. Another person tagged a realtor. The picture gathered praise and a kind of acquiescent admiration. Then someone messaged her directly. "Hey, your photo's weird. Why is there a white smear at the bottom?" She opened the image and saw it. An overexposed band cut across the cushion where the seam lay, as if a light had chosen to erase the junction between fabric and frame. In the days that followed, she noticed the cedar scent drifting into odd places. The bathroom she used after midnight, the back of a coat hanging in the hallway, under the mattress in the guest room. The scent was never strong enough to name with certainty. It was a presence that suggested someone had been moving enough cedar through the house to leave a trail. Sometimes, in the quiet hours after midnight, Julia would find that the cedar box had been moved an inch from where she had left it. The gray button nudged from its nook. Once she found the button on the kitchen floor, as if it had slipped from the pocket of some ghostly suit. She picked it up. It was cool and unremarkable, the precise color of an unassuming stone. She thought of writing it down in a list of odd things, but the list was a private document she did not yet trust. She told her mother on the phone in the way people disclose small disarrays, with a reserve that begged for the practical and not the dramatic. Her mother's voice was a steady instrument. "Locks changed?" her mother asked. "Yes," Julia said. He's been careful." "Don't be proud of being chosen, Julie," her mother said. "Being chosen is not the same as being safe, you know that." "But do you understand? He's not the type. He's careful." "You're careful," her mother said. "Keep your phone charged. Keep Kem close. Don't leave the cameras to do all the work." She repeated those words to herself like a technique. Keep your phone charged. Keep Kem close. She walked through the house and placed the cedar box on a low shelf, button tucked inside. She put the camera back in the lamp. She left a small, handwritten note under the cushion, if only for herself. "Look. Remember to look." She liked the imperative. It felt like an instruction whose power was in its simplicity. The first clear sign that something else had entered her life, in a way not mediated by screens, came on an ordinary afternoon. The city had turned translucent from rain, and the house took on that sterile museum calm. She was cataloging, book spines, notes, while Billy answered emails on the terrace. He laughed at something, and the sound was bright enough that it made the house feel like a place a person returned to when the outside world overall remained tolerable. She was smoothing a napkin when she heard it. A movement under the couch, the kind of mammal, not human sound that suggested a shape shifting against fabric. At first she thought it was a rat, and in the same instant she knew it was not. The movement had the economy of a thing that chose its gestures. She dropped to her knees, palm on the seam, and felt the fabric against her hand. The seam was cool. For a foolish, reflexive second she imagined fishing out some toy or lost piece of jewelry. Then the fabric gave under a pressure that was not her fingers, and not the cushioning of the upholstery, and something touched her. It was an appendage. A small, deliberate surface that pressed against her palm like an argument. It was not a hand. The idea of fingers, opposable, knuckled, did not fit. It was slick and cool, and when she first grazed it she felt the shock of scale beneath a skin that was not quite skin. It did not seize or claw. It rested, a measured contact that could have been mistaken for lingering curiosity. Cedar rose sharply. An intensification of the room's scent, as if whatever this was carried Cedar into the house like a scent mark. Julia did not scream. She had, in her life, cultivated a way of moving that kept panic within the margins. This was practical talent as much as temperament. She withdrew her hand slowly, heart knocking as if it had been loaned out for another's use. She expected the couch to return to being an inert thing, but the seam puckered where the appendage had been, as if a seam had been gently pinched inward and then let go. On the cushion lay a faint ridge, an impression like a small, precise fingerprint of pressure, and a smell so cedary it made the back of her throat memory loud. She grabbed the phone and filmed with hands that trembled just enough to make the picture shake human. She trained the camera lens on the seam and the cushion and the square of floor beneath. The video stuttered to life, registering the room in ordinary pixels, her own breath, a little ragged, in the audio. She clicked stop and then clicked play. For 17 seconds the recording held. The couch seam, the lamplight, the cedar box like a small promise. At exactly 17 seconds and 8 frames, the image collapsed into a white square. The audio collapsed into a thin hiss, and then a nothing. The video file remained on the phone as a file, intact in size, but its content had erased itself like an embarrassed witness. She ran to the lamp camera, pulled out the card. It appeared normal. She slid it into her laptop. The footage played back perfectly until the place the phone had gone white. Then the footage stopped, washed into that same white square. She felt, with a high, accelerating clarity, that she had touched something that did not want to be shown. The presence was uncompromisingly intimate and guarded. She called Kem within minutes. His face, when he came, carried the speeded seriousness of someone who treats friends like accounts. Update, mitigate. He watched the file and asked questions with fingers tapping the keyboard, a professional who believed in processes. "Corruption," he said finally, like a diagnosis. "But this is weird corruption. No buffer overrun, no format error. It's like the sensor blanked." "Can you fix it?" she asked. "No." He took a breath. "There are ways to try. But if it's intentional, if something is interfering with the recording, then we're not going to reverse it with a screwdriver. She wanted to tell someone who could insist on certainty. She wanted a municipality with a white-coated name and an official stamp to stand behind her and say, yes, what you saw happened. But she had already begun to suspect that what she required from the world was not an institution's absolution, but her own discipline. This, she thought, more than any proof, would be the work, to make her attention reliable in the face of erasure. Billy came home at dusk that day and kissed her forehead as he entered the room. He was radiant with the success of a long meeting that had gone well. "Did you get the video to work?" he asked, as if he knew what would matter and what would not. She said nothing at first. He saw the disarray, the laptop screen open to a frozen white rectangle. He watched her face, and then, like an expert reader, interpreted an emotion that fit his needs. "Corrupted file," he said, with the pivoting skill of someone who could translate misfortune into a technicality. "We'll have it looked at. I'll have someone look at it." She did not tell him, not then, that the thing under the couch had rested against her hand with the sort of patience reserved for small animals and certain strangers. She did not tell him about the sudden Cedar surge, the way it had felt like a signature pressed to skin. Instead, she reached for the button, found it in the cedar box like a coin tucked into a narrative. She slipped it into her palm and felt its coolness. The button sat like a private talisman. She placed it beneath her tongue metaphorically, like a secret she would not give up. The next morning, a man in a pressed uniform came with a clipboard, because Billy had the networks to summon assistants that smelled of authority. He looked at the camera, and at the file, and at the seam, and scored the house with a kind of professional detachment. He swabbed surfaces with sterile pads that she imagined might grow a report, a ledger of particles, if only the world could translate Cedar into testimony. "You might have a sensor fault," he said, the convenient conclusion of someone who had seen many house owners fret for many reasons. "Or a software issue. We can recommend a tech." Billy nodded smoothly. "Get me a report." The man left his card, and an hour later a technician drifted through with the languid confidence of contractors who had schedules of other people's strange things. He reset cameras, swapped cards, ran diagnostics. He nodded at the cedar box like a botanist to a sample. He handed Julia a paper detailing the tests. His words were technical and kind: calibration, interference, sampling error. He suggested placing a new firmware patch. He suggested a second camera. He suggested leaving the house alone for a night to compare heat signatures. She did all of it. She slept on the couch with the lamp turned to its lowest glow, a kind of preventative. She arranged mirrors so that the seam could be seen reflected twice, one mirror high on the bookshelf, another propped low like a second eye. She learned how to angle the light to minimize overexposure and maximize texture. She liked arranging because arranging was a form of argument against the unknown. If the house was a stage, she would place her lamps like actors and give them precise marks. The camera still failed sometimes. Once, when she left the house in the middle of one of Billy's long dinners, she returned to find the cedar box tilted on its shelf and the gray button lying by the couch as if it had been moved by a careless hand. She felt a hot void inside, a place that wanted to make the movement meaningful. She took the button and rubbed it between two fingers. The cedar smell was faint, but when she lifted it to her nose the scent swelled as if the object exhaled. The impression was that she owned a small, private proof, and that proof answered only to touch. At the gallery opening the following week, Billy circulated like a presence tailored by good decisions. He introduced Julia as a friend, as a person with taste, and people accepted the identity as soon as it was announced. A photographer took their picture. The flash made the world a precise geometry of light and shadow. Later, when someone posted the group photo, Julia noticed that where she and Billy stood, a pale curve sat between them, a slight overexposure across Billy's jacket at the place where his fingers rested against her back. The comment thread was generous. Someone admired the color of her dress. Someone else praised Billy's smile. No one remarked on the pale curve save an observant friend who murmured to Julia, "Looks like someone aimed their light right." There was a practical ache in Julia, the sort of ache that comes from repeated small refusals of the world to validate you. People spoke about her house in the same way they spoke about good restaurants. They admired the aesthetic. They appreciated the host. No one wanted to entertain the idea that the seam of a couch might contain something other than fabric. If she had wanted to be heroic, That night at the gallery would have been the moment. She could have stepped forward and told them the story. She could have made a claim loud enough to force a public investigation. Instead, she felt the logic of restraint. Spectacle would obligate explanation, and explanation might wind into humiliation. She had lived enough to know humiliation is often louder than wrong. She chose silence. She chose to rearrange rather than to expose. She chose to make the house a better guarded place. She bought a second camera and placed it in the window facing the street to catch anyone who might approach. She threaded mirrors like sentries, leaning one against the bookshelf so that its reflection made the room double and uncertain. She learned all the small domestic strategies of people who live with fragile things. Leave a lamp on to make shadows predictable. Line the threshold with cedar shavings to test for disturbance. Keep a towel in the bedroom drawer to muffle any sounds that might leak under a door. Kem grew less amused and more watchful. He came by more often, sometimes to help, more often to sit in silence and observe the domestic rituals she performed. He kept his questions practical. Have you changed the passwords? Are you sleeping? What do the cameras show at other times? He would, at irregular intervals, return with graphs and logs laid out on paper like talismans of rationality. When she showed him the photographs that went white, he frowned and said, "People ask for proof." Proof, she discovered, is often absent. He had a way of rephrasing her inner sentence into something less private, and when he did, it made it feel necessary. Rumors began, as rumors will in neighborhoods stitched together by polite conversation. A neighbor mentioned on a phone call that they had seen Billy at a cafe with a woman he did not know. Someone else found one of Billy's old business cards under a stair and speculated, openly but without malice, about how a man could have many places and no true anchor. But no one spoke of the seam or of skin or of scales. The household anomalies were swallowed into comfortable theories. Camera glitches, eccentric scents, a house that attracted stories. One night, alone with the house, Julia sat on the floor and spread out photographs like a detective who had never been trained but had the temperament for small collections. Each image, the white blank, the washed seam, the overexposed curve. On the edge of one photograph was a faint crescent, cedar dust lined as if a small object had been dragged along fabric and left a trace. She traced that crescent with a fingernail and felt the history of something that had pressed to cloth. She thought of Billy's hand against her back in the photograph at the gallery. He had the ease of someone who could control social meaning with a glance. He wore his charm like a well-pressed coat. There were times she felt she was living next to a demonstration of social capital, rather than in the presence of a private person. She had no desire to unmake his charm, partly because charm had protected them both in small ways, but partly because she feared what would happen if she named what she had felt. Naming, she understood, is a way of inviting disbelief. The appendage returned once, when the house was emptied of guests and she was alone in the late blue of the afternoon. It emerged from under the couch seam with the economy of an animal that does not feel safe in being obvious. This time it pressed against her wrist, low and patient, mapping the lines of her skin without aggression. The scales were cool and luminous under the lamplight, not wet, but having a sheen like fish hidden out of water. The cedar smell suddenly became as close to a voice as scent can be, an assertion, a signature. She touched it back, not from bravado, but from a methodical curiosity. The contact was less than a second. It left on her skin a faint cooling that felt like a bruise made of air. No pain, only a rearrangement of perception. She reached for a camera with the quiet speed of someone who has rehearsed a motion in private. Lens, focus, frame. She filmed the seam as it moved. Again, the file blanked to a white square at 17 seconds and 8 frames. The audio hummed and died. This time she did not call Kem immediately. She stood in the living room with the cup of lukewarm tea cooling in her hand and thought of leaving. The sentence aired in her mind as if a different woman, someone she used to be, were speaking. I should have run away. In the same breath another, softer voice replied, but I fell in love. It was a statement true enough to complicate any simple moral. Love, here, had been the conductor of her initial decisions. To abandon the house was to abandon an intimacy that had anchored her in ways she could not simply enumerate. The way Billy read the room. How he remembered what she liked for breakfast. The way he had propped her up when an editor had said no. Love is not a single thing. It is economy and habit. and the insistence of someone's presence. She felt suddenly the ache of complicity. She had wanted the selection, the belonging. She had let the seam be part of her domestic script. She learned, in the days that followed, that loving someone does not always produce a clear chain of loyalty. Sometimes love rearranges your defenses. Sometimes it teaches you to accept plausible explanations, because they are less costly than suspicion. She also learned that love, in some settings, requires a re-education of attention. She had to become someone who noticed small truths, and also practiced caution. Someone who could live with a private knowledge, and still operate in public. One afternoon a neighbor knocked and asked if she had installed a new diffuser. "There's this cedar smell coming from your place," the neighbor said, embarrassed. "It's lovely. I thought you might be having people over." She smiled and said nothing that would disrupt the neighbor's casual admiration. Later she slid the gray button into the cedar box, closed it, and put the box on a higher shelf where it would be seen but not casually handled. She kept a lamp on at night and left a mirror leaning at a nonchalant angle. She made lists, camera angles, spare batteries, who to call in case of a file that blanked again. Each item was an exercise in making the house less porous. When she called the police, they were kind, as people with callous jobs can be, and their responses were bounded by procedural limits. They came, took notes, and suggested technical reports. A patrol officer told her gently that sometimes the explanation was mundane, a short in the circuit, a bad sensor. He said, "We'll log it," which was a way of offering practical comfort without promising the truth would be acknowledged. Billy suggested, at one point with genuine concern, that they could move. "We can leave," he said, the way someone offers a solution that will not cost them social standing. His offer was both generous and curious. She listened to him, watched his mouth form the letters of escape as if escape could be written into the margin of their lives. She thought of boxes and moving trucks, and the logistic choreography of starting again. She also thought of the bed that carried the cedar perfume and the way she liked the light at the window. She had moved through grief enough to know that leaving was not always salvation. Sometimes leaving simply moved a problem into a different set of hands. Kem, suggested a more technical workaround. "If the recording's blank," he said, "maybe we shouldn't rely only on digital. Tape, analog, something that resists corruption." He sounded half amused and half terrified by the intimacy of the problem. He liked lists and fixes. He offered to stay overnight and calibrate cameras. She accepted because accepting keeps allies near. That night, with Kem in the armchair and the lamp's red light flickering like a tiny human heart, the house breathed in and out around them. They reviewed footage. They spoke quietly. And when the clock chimed 3 in the morning, and the city outside softened to the distant running of buses, Kem said, "People ask for proof. Proof," she discovered, is often absent. He meant it as a wry observation and as an appeal to practical action. He meant, perhaps, that life sometimes requires you to build your own proofs. She felt the truth of that, and felt it as a burden. She went to bed with the lamp on and the second camera aimed. She placed her hand on the linen and felt the hollow where it had been touched once before. She pressed her thumb to the gray button in the cedar box. A small private ritual, and thought again of the sentence that had come in the daylight. "I should have run away, but I fell in love." It hung between her like an accusation and like an excuse, and like both it demanded a response. In the morning she woke to the cedar scent in the hallway, and tucked into the corner of the coffee table where the seam's shadow lay, a faint ridge in the fabric. It was not dramatic, but it had the patient insistence of a thing that knows it has been where it has been. She took a photograph with a camera she had set to analog simulation, and then another with a phone she had not let touch the cloud. Both images were ordinary, showing the seam as expected. Later, when she transferred the files, the phone picture contained a pale square where the cushion met the arm, the predictable whiteout at 17 seconds. The analog simulation showed nothing of the missing seam. It was as if different modes of attention did not agree on what the world contained. For a long time she sat with that disagreement, and the knowledge that the house had changed her. She had become careful in the manner of someone who has been given a set of instructions, and must keep to them to survive. She learned to move without rustling too loudly, to test using cedar dust like breadcrumbs laid out to diagnose intrusion. She kept the glass of water on the coffee table as if it were both offering and trial. Letters came. Nothing official. A press release for a philanthropic event Billy hosted. An invitation to a fundraiser. Small social notices that continued the world's indifferent flow. For every institutional brush the house received, security visits, polite technicians, there was a social stream that flowed on as if no seam had ever existed. People accepted the visual of his life posted online. They liked the pictures and commented hearts. No one tuned into what she had seen. One evening she stood at the window and watched Billy leave for a dinner in a suit that fit him like an argument made true. He kissed her lightly and said, "See you tomorrow." It was the perfect utterance, the kind that allows life to proceed without interrogation. She watched the car disappear down the street. The taillights a small pair of heartbeat red points. She turned back to the house and to the seam, and to the cedar box where the button rested like an unspoken key. She ran a hand across the cedar box lid and felt the faint grooved line on the top where the wood had been planed. It was a precise small geometry, domestic and final. She lifted the lid, and the scent swelled like a signature. Inside the box the button lay like evidence put away in a pocket. She closed it carefully, as if closing a book mid-sentence, and placed it on the shelf. Then she began to assemble a new list. Mirrors angled, lamp on, second camera, door alarm, chems number on speed dial. The list was not a plan of siege. It was a grammar of survival. When she slid into bed that night, the cedar lingered and the lamp painted a soft arc across the wall that allowed the room to be ordinary. She thought of leaving, again, and of staying. The decision felt less like capitulation and more like a strategic posture. If the world would not account for what she experienced, then she would account for herself. She would reshape the house into an instrument of attention. She would learn to read the small signatures, cedar where it should not be, a button not in its place, a white square at 17 seconds. These would be her maps. The house kept its promises and its seams. Somewhere under the couch, at odd hours and with a patience that did not invite spectacle, something watched the world through fabric and cedar. Julia understood, in the way one understands grammar, that nothing about what she had seen would be easily translated. She could make evidence. She could gather witnesses. She could even try to force a light into the seam. But there would always be another kind of erasure. Photographs that went white, visitors who preferred not to notice. Institutions able to narrate everything into ordinary language. To insist on exposure risked becoming a spectacle, a reduction of her interior life to an object lesson. She folded the sheet around her and let the lamp's light make a small, faithful island. Her last thought before sleep was a practical one. Tomorrow, replace the battery. The second camera must be tested at dawn. Angle the mirror. Leave the cedar box open by a notch so she could smell it when she needed it. She learned to convert fear into lists, distress into careful domestic acts. Outside, the city was ordinary, and inside, her house smelled of cedar. She should have run away, she thought again. Not as reproach this time, but as an observation. But she had also fallen in love. The two truths were not reconciled. They were simply present, like two sides of a coin that could be turned but not flattened. And under the couch, patient and anonymous, the seam held a presence that smelled of wood and moved like something that did not crave being explained. In the kitchen, the gray button waited for her fingers. She put her hand in her pocket and felt its cool weight like a practiced reminder. The house pulsed, patient and indifferent. The day had yielded a new set of tasks. She rose and began them, arranging lamps and mirrors with a steady domestic care that felt not like defeat, but like a new method of attention. She moved the cedar box to a place where it could be seen and not touched, and kept the camera roll backed up in 3 places. When the phone buzzed that afternoon with a message from a stranger, "Did you ever get the photo fixed?" She stared at the screen and wrote back a single line. "It's more complicated than that." Then she set the phone face down, breathed in cedar, and sat by the lamp until the light softened. The house held its quiet contradictions, and so did she. Learning the grammar of living with a presence that would not be named. She taught herself to measure presence the way one learns a new language. Slow, with attention to the small consonants of movement. It became an apprenticeship in noticing the unnoticeable. A dust line, the tilt of a vase, the way a cuff brushed fabric. She learned to read interruptions as if they were weather, signs to be prepared for, not prophecies to be feared. The house, which had once promised complete belonging, now functioned as a laboratory for these refinements. She invented tests that were at once domestic and exact. A cedar shaving dotted across the threshold to see if it was disturbed, a ribbon placed in the back of a chair as a motion detector. She wrote the results in a slim notebook, whose pages she kept folded at the back. Not because she wanted to hide them, but because the act of recording made the facts hers in a small, defensible way. Billy went about his life in the way people do when they are not required to notice the seam. He left for meetings early and returned at odd hours with the air of someone who had considered many worlds, and decided to keep this one uncomplicated. He kissed her in the mornings with the practiced gentleness of a man who had seen the contours of relationships, and knew how to preserve the image of intimacy. He was persuasive in public. Friends and strangers accepted the gloss of his presence as sufficient testimony. At times, watching him move through rooms affording him deference, Julia felt the old disquiet return. A knowledge that social currency could make almost anything invisible. But the love she felt was not only appetite for easy light, it was also tethered to small acts of care that had once sustained her. Kem became, more than before, a daily presence in the early hours when the house still smelled most distinctly of cedar. He installed a battery of analog devices, an old Super 8 camera he swore was less prone to elegant erasure, a tape recorder with a heavy spool, a Polaroid that insisted on its own chemistry. He came with a satchel of practical remedies and the pragmatic faith of someone who believed that systems could be made to work if one was persistent enough. "If the world is going to misplace the photograph," he said, laying a hand on the cedar box with a tacit respect, "we'll capture the event in ways machines resenting quick fixes cannot erase." They tried everything a household could invent. Kem wired a small analog sensor beneath the couch, the kind used to register pressure in vintage security systems, and fed its signal to a reel that would not be subject to the modern whiteout she had learned to dread. Julia grew expert at the movements of these tests. How to set a camera without alerting someone else who might regard the ritual as performative. How to slow her breathing so the audio would record a steady baseline. How to angle light so texture would be legible even under a flash. The more she catalogued, the more she realized evidence behaved less like truth than punctuation. It could be present, absent, or smudged into ambiguity. One humid afternoon, while Billy was away and the house hummed with the slow electrical rhythm of idleness, the sensor beneath the couch registered a rise in pressure. The reel, an old spool of magnetic tape in a dented case, captured a sequence of low frequencies. The faint, precise movement of something pressing against fabric, a soft rasp that might have been scales. Kem sat beside the machine and watched the needle oscillate like an ancient heart monitor. He rewound and played it again and again until the sound became less strange, domesticated by repetition into a pattern of pulses. They listened without speaking until the tape finished, and the tape head clicked gently at the spool's end. Then they translated their silence into practical steps. "This is something," Kem said. His voice had the sober heat of someone who had finally made a ledger reconcile. "This sounds like a mechanical interference, but I have no frame for what kind. If it's not mechanical, then it's something else. Either way, keep this." Julia wrapped the reel in a paper towel and tucked it into the cedar box, as if the wood might keep the evidence honest. The box, which had once been a decorative curiosity, had become a small trust chest. The button, cool and matte, slid into the box beside the reel, and when she closed the lid, the room carried the cedar scent like punctuation, a full stop made of wood. They took a Polaroid that afternoon as well, an impulsive analog habit meant to outrun the eraser of modern tech. Julia set the camera, held her breath, clicked the shutter, and then waited while the white border matured into an image. The picture bloomed with the ordinary domestic geometry. The couch, a book on the coffee table, the lamp's brass stem. At the corner of the photograph, almost as an afterthought, the emulsion left a faint shimmer like a seam seen against light. It was not the distinct imprint of scales, but it was a mark that invited interpretation. Against the drawer reasoning inside her, it said only, "Something was there." When she showed the Polaroid to Kem, his smile was small and relieved. "Not definitive," he said. "But it's something." They took steps to make the house into a place that could resist erasure without becoming a stage for performance. Mirrors multiplied eyes. Lamps stayed lit to tame shadows. Cedar shavings formed delicate patterns that could be read like weather. She purchased a lamp with a wide, flat shade, and had a technician discreetly wire a second camera into the light so that two independent systems might cross-validate a moment. There were nights, endless and stitched with trial, when they lay awake like experimenters, the room lit by a faint green machine glow while they compared logs and petrograph paper. It was slow work. It was the kind of domestic insurgency that felt like love, and like survival at once. The neighborhood adapted a little around them. Rumor is a patient animal and prefers gentle suspicions to confrontations. People smiled in the way unfamiliar with danger. Polite, a shade speculative. A woman from downstairs started to bring Julia small bouquets with cedar sprig accents, just because, and Julia kept them in a glass on the counter like tests that smelled of community. At one of Billy's charity barbecues, the sort of elegantly casual affair where people invest in warmth without wanting to be disturbed, someone posted pictures that evening with a caption meant to flatter: casual generosity, summer light. A friend tagged Julia and Billy, and the comments accumulated the small social currencies of likes and hearts. One photograph taken from a distance showed Julia laughing with her head tipped back, as Billy leaned in with his hand at the small of her back. At the edge of the posted image, where the cushion should have been, there shimmered the faint white blur that had by now become a motif. An acquaintance messaged her privately. "There's something weird in your lounge. Did you see it?" She opened the image, and for a moment, wished she could respond with thunder. Instead, she wrote back a measured note. "I know, thanks, I'm working on it." The reply was true and only partly useful. On a Wednesday evening, when the city seemed to drape itself in a slow, wet blue, Julia came home to find a man from the security firm waiting on the front steps. He wore a plain jacket and carried a professional distance like a shield. He had been sent at Billy's request to install a more comprehensive array of systems. "Network redundancy," he explained, as if offering reassurance. "We can create independent channels across providers. Cross-checks reduce the risk of corruption." Julia watched him move through the house with the casual scrutiny of someone who had learned to see the mechanisms behind actors. He installed devices with gentle efficiency, a set of motion sensors along the baseboard, a microphone with a windscreen, an independent archival recorder. He left them running and promised a report that would specify whether the whiteouts were machine errors or something less ordinary. The report came with professional ambiguity. "No obvious hardware fault," it said in a polite typeface, a public-sounding sentence that asked for further investment rather than promising resolution. A technician recommended a series of firmware updates, a change of providers, and in fine print, the concession that some anomalies defied immediate classification. Billy took the document with a diplomat's calm, gave the man a check, and at dinner they spoke as people do about problems that can be put into budgets and scheduled for attention. Julia read the report, and then slid it into the cedar box without comment. The document, with its careful hedges and polite certainties, came close to validating her experience while also dancing away from naming it. She understood why the world preferred hedging. A life that accepted hedge and smiled could maintain its commerce and its lightness. Months accumulated like small stones she placed in a jar. They were not incidents so much as adjustments, calibrations of a life that insisted on being ordinary. She learned to wake in the middle of the night and take inventory. A ritual of counting lamps, mirrors, and the placement of the cedar box against a shelf. She developed an etiquette for when the presence showed itself. Keep hands visible, avoid sudden movements, speak softly if necessary. She was not attempting to befriend the unknown. She was negotiating terms of cohabitation. The appendage, mercifully, remained intermittent. It would surface for seconds, no more, pressing against cloth, nudging at a seam, making its cedar signature felt, and then retreating to whatever reserve it preferred. There were moments in which the contact felt less like violation, and more like a territorial examination, a thing mapping the world by touch. Once, when she sat cross-legged on the rug, it uncoiled in a careful gesture that was almost shy, a slick, luminous curve that rested against her ankle, with the softness of a sea creature on a rock. She watched it rather than touching it, because watching was now part of the contract she had written with herself. When she did lay a palm against it later, gentle, deliberate, it felt cool and unexpectedly dry, like varnished wood that had been warmed habitually by someone else's hands. She noticed, in those moments, that the cedar scent did not always travel evenly. It concentrated like punctuation near where the appendage had made contact, leaving microscopic filaments of scent that might be read by future instruments if such instruments could be trusted to interpret them. She kept a small vial labeled cedar residue in the cedar box, a private joke with an earnest tilt, material collected like evidence but kept as a relic. Billy never acknowledged these things directly in public. He was prudent in a way that protected the larger social scripts they both moved through. There were times she wondered whether he saw what she felt and chose to disregard it, whether his silence was strategic kindness or a willful ignorance. Once, in bed, in a rare clarity softened by the lamp's arc, she asked him a question that she had rehearsed a dozen ways. "Does it feel like anything to you?" she said. He considered her face in the lamplight, his expression something like an editor weighing which truth to print. "Sometimes I smell cedar," he said finally. "Sometimes things feel off. But I also know how quickly stories spread. If we start telling every anecdote, we'll end up rearranging our lives around gossip." His words were reasonable. They were also an economy of escape. A life rearranged around gossip could be protected against in the abstract, but might also be an exile from intimacy. She did not press him. Love has intervals that are also choices, to press or to preserve. She wanted him to be her ally. Yet she also began to suspect that his refusal to anchor the seam with words was as much a part of the person she loved as his capacity to remember what she liked for breakfast. A small scandal rolled through the neighborhood. A misreported affair at a nearby condo, the kind of gossip that prefers simple villains. People's attention moved, as attention will, and the house was for a time spared the brazen curiosity of others. During that lull, she took a trip with her mother to buy linens and choose curtains that could be drawn differently. Her mother moved with a steady practicality, suggesting heavier drapes, a deadbolt changed again, a plan for a friend to stay overnight occasionally. "You're not an island," her mother said, handing Julia a bolt of fabric to feel. "People will stand with you when you let them. But don't expect the world to march at your timeline." The trip was a reprieve and a rehearsal, another set of small domestic acts that knitted into the grammar she had been inventing. Back home, Julia implemented the new curtains and placed a lamp by the window that cast the street light in a non-threatening wash. She liked the feeling of producing light on her terms. Then, in a late fall week when the city smelled of cold and coal and the wind had a way of reorienting grief into focus, she received an email that rippled through her like a low note. A local blogger, a woman with a modest following who wrote about urban interiors, had included a photograph of Billy's living room in a piece about how to blend old comfort with new design. The photo was tasteful, the caption generous. In the comments, someone had magnified the image and posted a cropped close-up of the couch seam. There, in an enlarged pixel map, a pale crescent shimmered like a bruise of light. The commentator wrote underneath, "Okay, but what is that weird mark at the cushion? Glitch?" The thread filled with jokes and guesses, a few earnest suggestions about camera angles. A debate chewed itself into a neat social knot and then unraveled. The white smear had become a meme for an afternoon, a thing people could observe and then discard. The world, sustaining, pragmatic, and lazy, took the anomaly and turned it into talk. It did not ask for Julia's authenticity. She felt, in reading the thread, both vindicated and invisible. Vindication because the mark had been noticed by others. Invisible because noticing was not the same as validating her experience. The attention was performative and brief. It did not come with the kind of witness she had wanted. Witness, she understood now, had two registries: public acclaim that could be quick and harsh, or private affirmation that solidified over time. She preferred the latter. One afternoon the appendage pushed further than it had before. She was alone, the apartment muffled with rain, the lamps making the room resemble the interior of a shell. She had been rearranging a shelf and had set the cedar box near the edge as if to tempt any curiosity into the open. The couch seemed to breathe with humidity. Without the dramatic preface of any heralding sound, something slid from its hidden place and settled against her calf. The contact was deliberate and lagged like a thought taking its time. She felt no fury, only a tightening of attention. The scale pattern was now unmistakable to her touch, overlapping small ridges that fit together like a crafted mosaic. It was cool, as if it had been stored in a room with low temperature. When she touched it, the appendage flattened a little, a simple, non-verbal negotiation. She breathed steadily, and, with the exact deliberation she had practiced for months, she spoke aloud, not to coax, but to mark the boundary. "Not the face," she said. "There are sentences that do not ask to be obeyed, and are obeyed anyway, because the tone is exact." The appendage did not move toward her face. It did, however, tighten the press it had against her calf, as if noting the command. For a long, porous second, the presence and the woman negotiated terms. When it withdrew, it left on the skin a faint, cooling pressure, like a memory rather than a bruise. Afterwards, she sat for a long time in the lamplight, holding the gray button in her hand, feeling the small, solid fact of it. She thought then of running. She thought of leaving and found the idea less a clean rescue than a migration of complexity. She had, she realized, two lives occupying the same domestic frame, the life that moved through public rooms and acquired favors and friends, and the life that registered small, uncanny facts. The seam between these two lives was now where she spent her energy. The moral question, if it can be put so plainly, was not whether she should leave, but on what terms she should live. She had learned that exposure did not guarantee protection. In fact, exposure often invited complacency or spectacle. She had also learned that secrecy carried its own costs: isolation, the slow corrosion of intimacy when the person you loved did not fully recognize the same seam. She began to see the decision as one of language. She could call the world to witness in a way that would convert her home into a public theater, or she could fortify her own practices and keep the knowledge as a private competence. The turning point, if one could give that word to a life that had been so resistant to drama, came on an ordinary Monday. A small power outage swept through the upper blocks, and the city shrank into incandescent pockets of light. Julia walked to the window with a ceramic mug in her hands and watched a neighbor light a candle. Across the street, someone walked a dog that tugged impatiently against a leash. The lamps in her living room made private islands of shadow. Billy came home earlier than usual that day, his energy untroubled by fatigue. He found her at the window and paused there as if savoring the view through her. He had the kind of return that carried with it an unspoken assumption. The world would resume. He kissed her loosely and without preface said, "We could leave. Take a weekend away. Breathe." She looked at him in the dim light and let the offer sit for a moment. It was tempting in the way a good alibi can be tempting. She thought of boxes and trips and the way love had once been tied to the idea of being chosen. She thought of the Cedar box with its reels and reels of private notation. Her hand closed around the gray button in her pocket. "I won't run," she said. It was not a dramatic refusal. It was a precise statement of intent. "But I'm not willing to make it into something it isn't. I'm not willing to make a spectacle of this." Billy's face softened. For a breath it looked like agreement, like the pairing of two people who had decided on an economy that preserved comfort. He kissed her forehead and said nothing more. She took his silence as a small truce. She did not know if it was permanent. After that night she began to formalize what she had been practicing. She established a schedule for camera checks, a code with Chem for immediate response, and an inventory ritual that included the Cedar box, the Polaroids, and the analog reel. She wrote a short list she called procedures and taped it inside the Cedar box lid. The list was not a plan for conquest. It was a grammar of attention: mirrors angled, lamp lit, Cedar box open by a notch, button safe, camera battery charged. She read it like a prayer and set the box in a place where she could reach it quickly. In the months that followed, she transformed the house into a place that made room for both light and guardedness. Neighbors adapted. Some came to recognize the second camera's red dot and nodded as if understanding that small precautions were part of modern living. Chem remained a constant, an ally who measured facts and translated them into manageable steps. Her mother learned to leave fresh towels on the guest bed and to call more often. Billy continued to move in polite circles and to bring home small, thoughtful things. A book he thought she would like, a scarf in a shade she had mentioned only once. There were times when she thought they might stitch back to a life that was less complicated by secret knowledge. There were other times when she felt the quiet press of the seam like an inevitability. Outside, the world carried on its business with the generous indifference it always had. Social media posted images that sometimes flashed the white smear and sometimes did not. Photographers took pictures that, depending on the device, either revealed or erased the seam. Some images left a pale curve, some left nothing, and commentators argued about technicalities the way people argue about weather. The ambiguity suited the world. It allowed most people to continue as if nothing personal had happened. Once, at a small cafe where the light collected on pastry, she saw a photograph in the local paper. Billy, smiling, hands folded at a gala. Someone had captioned the picture with the mild praise of a social column. She felt, for a pulse, the old hunger for public acknowledgement. The idea that if the world saw and accepted, she might be absolved of private watchfulness. Then she felt the other side of the choice. Spectacle would take her private competence and turn it into a show. She would be famous and exhausted in equal measure. She could not imagine the seam being an exhibit. Instead, she kept to the grammar of home. She placed a small mirror by the front door so that the seam would be visible in reflection as well as directly. She slept on the couch more often, cocooned by lamps and pillows, because the living room offered the vantage she had learned to trust. She wore the button on a loop inside the hem of her coat when she belonged anywhere else, and kept it as a private talisman. A pebble that reminded her she had chosen how to live. The appendage's visits grew less frequent. It may have been the lamps, the mirrors, the Cedar rituals, or the way she had quietly reasserted a field of attention that the presence respected in its own inscrutable way. There were months when it did not surface, and months when it did. Always brief, always deliberate. In the between times she rebuilt herself, assembly by careful assembly. She practiced saying the sentence that had first immobilized her with its honesty. I should have run away, but I fell in love. She spoke it aloud in the mirror sometimes, not as confession, but as a fact that required integration. One evening towards spring, she accepted an invitation to a small fundraiser Billy was hosting, more out of the need for public normalcy than any curiosity. The party was modest, lit like a watercolor, actors in elegant clothes moving in soft arcs. Someone took their photograph at one point, a candid mid-laughter shot that later became a small private memory. A friend texted her a low-resolution copy that showed a pale curve where the seam met Billy's coat. The image traveled briefly through polite channels and settled. Later that week, a neighbor came by with a slice of lemon cake and an earnest question. Are you all right? There are some people speculating. Nothing mean, just questions. You know how it is. She thanked the woman and, as she poured coffee for the neighbor, felt a new steadiness. She did not need public validation to anchor her life, she thought. She needed practices that preserved her sense of agency and allowed the presence, whatever it was, to remain something she could live with without surrendering her autonomy. The final shape of the decision was not a sign or a manifesto, but a collection of small acts. She taught herself to carry a lamp-like attention into other rooms. Notice the way a coat hung, the position of a book, the track of ash in an ashtray. She kept her phone turned off at night unless Kem checked it. She began to teach herself a language of small resistances. How to retreat from a conversation without conceding truth. How to smile when the world did not validate. How to refuse spectacle while preserving intimacy. At the end, the house remained a paradox. It was both refuge and stage, a place of cedar and seams. The appendage remained a presence that did not want to be shown, and the world remained a place that preferred its images tidy. Julia lived among those tensions with a new grammar she had written herself. It was not heroic in the dramatic sense. It was patient and procedural. It was a way to be neither a martyr to the uncanny, nor a person perpetually uprooted by fear. She would not run away. She would not make the seam into a public entertainment. She would instead inhabit an economy of attention large enough to hold the presence and her love both. Months turned into a private calendar of quiet rituals. The cedar box lived on its shelf like a small altar. The button rested inside it, muted and necessary. Polaroids and tapes were stored in labeled envelopes. June reel, November Polaroid. Small attestations to the fact that she had been careful. She saved the reel that had captured the low rasp, and sometimes, when the house was very quiet and the lamp made a perfect pool of light, she would play it and let the low tone move through the air like a remembered voice. It comforted her in a way facts cannot always do, by confirming to her alone that something had been where she knew it had been, On a bright late morning she stopped at a cafe near the gallery district and sat by the window where people moved like a slow stream. She watched at her leisure the way sun divided the world into strips of light. A woman passed, wearing a scarf threaded with cedar sprigs. The same scent, faint and unexpected, riding with her. Julia's heart pricked, but the sensation was not the shock of fear so much as a recognition of pattern. The presence had a signature, and signatures repeat. Across the street, a couple argued softly, and then kissed as if in apology. A man walked his bicycle with a practiced slant. Life outside continued, earnest about its small dramas. She thought of Billy, of his suit and his smile, and of their careful arrangements, their choices for the day-to-day. She felt, as she had increasingly learned to feel, that to keep living was an act of sovereignty. When the phone buzzed that afternoon with a notification, someone had reposted a throwback photo of Billy at an event. She tapped to open it, and saw, as if in foreshortened time, a pale smear across the couch in the background. The caption beneath it praised the night, comments accumulated in a kind of cheerful ignorance. Julia smiled, emotion small and private. She placed one finger into her pocket and felt the gray button there, its cool weight a discreet echo. She sipped her coffee and watched people pass. Outside the cafe window, the city moved with its common, hospitable indifference. Inside her chest, a different insistence had grown into being. A steady, reserved comfort that she had not been erased. She had wanted, once, for the world to validate what she had witnessed. She had learned instead to validate herself. The house had asked for that price, not in vengeance, but in attention. She paid it willingly, in the only currency that mattered, because it returned to her as autonomy. In the end, she had not fled, and the reasons for that were neither simple nor shameful. Love, it turned out, had been complicated enough to ask for more than a clean exit. It asked for a life built with the knowledge that the person she loved carried otherness in his seams. It asked for a self who could live with that knowledge without being wholly undone. The sentence she had thought of as an accusation, "I should have run away," became instead a map of choice. She should have run, she did not. She stayed and learned how to live. The last image is quiet. Julia rising from the cafe, the gray button heavy in her pocket, the cedar scent a memory warm as a hand. She walked with the steady gait of someone who had rehearsed careful returns and practiced living inside them. Across the street, a group of people paused to photograph a small street mural. A man adjusted his camera and the little screen flashed, briefly showing an overexposed white where the mural's lower edge should have been. The same motif she now recognized as a kind of denial. She watched them argue about settings and exposure, as if the problem were always technical and never intimate. She would always miss perfect vindication. She would always feel the small thrum of wanting the world to be mirror-solid. But she had also gained something that was not public recognition, but a sturdier inner life. Methods, lists, friends who mattered, boundaries, the cedar-scented box she could open when the house felt particularly clear. She had learned to make attention itself into armor, the lamp's angle, the mirror's tilt, the habit of calling chem when a file went inexplicably white. Such armor was quiet and domestic, and required no audience. When she reached the building, she paused for a moment on the stoop and looked up at the apartment where light spilled like a pledge. She carried inside the day's small purchases and the living grammar she had constructed. The lamps to be checked, the mirrors to be adjusted, the cedar box closed by a notch. She thought with that particular domestic courage that she had learned to own her days. We do what we can with the world we have. Billy met her in the hallway, smiling in a way that offered the possibility of uncomplicated warmth. He took her hand, and the contact felt, even now, like a tether. In the pocket of her coat, the gray button warmed a little against her thigh, as if affirming the solidity of a private pact. She did not need to tell him everything she had learned to say aloud. The house had taught her a different lexicon, small truths, spoken by discreet rituals. Inside, the cedar box waited like a small country of facts. She set the groceries down, closed the door, and turned on the lamp. The light filled the room in a reliable arc, and the mirror reflected her twice, skin and intent. The seam under the couch lay quiet, and somewhere beneath fabric something kept its patient watch. She had not been rescued by proof or absolution. She had been steadied by the practices she had chosen. If this kind of intimate, unresolved suspense resonated with you, consider subscribing for more stories that linger in the spaces between evidence and feeling.